Welcome to episode 162 of Informed Choice Radio, where I speak to Daniel Hannan. What next for Brexit?
I think that the real advantage of Brexit is the ability to be a freer, more deregulated, low-tax, competitive economy. If I were Prime Minister and I had a plan, I wouldn't share it with the press. It would be absolutely crazy to start signalling to my negotiating partners what I was going to do before the talks had even started. No transition is ever completely smooth, or no important transition. If we didn't accept that, we'd never change anything. We mustn't make the mistake of confusing familiarity with certainty.
From Sundial House Studios in Cranleigh, welcome to Informed Choice Radio. This is the podcast all about achieving your financial goals in life. Here's your host, Martin Bamford.
I've got a confession to make. On Thursday, the 23rd of June 2016, I visited the polling station and, like every other adult in this country, answered a question. Should the United Kingdom remain a member of the European Union or leave the European Union? And like the majority of others who voted in this referendum, I voted to leave. I wasn't always in the leave camp. In the months leading up to referendum day, I devoted a huge amount of my time to reading, debating, and doing my best to understand the issues. As part of the Cranleigh Chamber of Commerce, I helped to arrange and host 2 panel debates on the subject. I also attended a panel debate hosted by one of my professional bodies, the Chartered Institute for Securities and Investment. The more I learnt about the European Union and its relationship with the United Kingdom, the more I swayed towards leave. The biggest single factor, though, in making up my mind was reading Why Vote Leave by my guest on the podcast today, Daniel Hannan. Dan Hannan is a writer and journalist. After 17 years as a member of the European Parliament campaigning for British withdrawal from the EU, he succeeded in abolishing his job in the Brexit referendum on the 23rd of June 2016. He is the author of 9 books, including the New York Times bestseller Inventing Freedom: How the English-Speaking Peoples Made the Modern World, and Sunday Times bestseller Why Vote Leave. His latest book and the subject of our conversation today is What Next? How to Get the Best from Brexit. In today's episode of Informed Choice Radio, I speak to Dan about why the experts got it wrong, how we should aim to have the freest possible trade with our European allies, understanding the difference between a free trade area and a customs union, why the Prime Minister would be crazy to share her negotiating strategy, whether we're still on track to trigger Article 50 by the end of March, and much more. You can find the show notes, full transcript and useful links for this episode at icradio.co.uk. If you enjoy listening, please do say thank you to Dan on Twitter, where you can find him at Daniel J. Hannan. I'd also massively appreciate your review of this podcast on iTunes. Visit icradio.co.uk/iTunes. That will take you straight to our page where you can leave a review and we'll read it out in a future episode. Welcome to What Next for Brexit with Daniel Hannan in episode 162 of Informed Choice Radio. Well, you must be one of the few people in the world who's ever campaigned to abolish his own job. Did you originally become an MEP with that as your goal?
I've always thought that the European Union was bad news for us. But although a lot of people struggle with this, I only really became completely determined to leave when the Prime Minister's renegotiation failed to bring back any power at all. I'd hoped that there would be some solution possible where we could get a looser deal and repatriate power while still remaining involved in a number of the policy areas as members. But, you know, by February, when the PM came back without a single power returned, without even a new treaty change, I think it became obvious that the EU was not capable of reform, and that therefore, if we wanted this looser deal, if we wanted a relationship based on common market, not common government, the only way of getting it was to leave.
And of course, now we're in a position where we're leaving. Ahead of the Brexit vote, all of the experts at the Bank of England and various economists all predicted we'd face a major recession in the event of Brexit. Now, that's not happened. Why did all of the experts get it wrong?
There's a whole academic discipline about why clever people make these mistakes. How, being clever, they overvalue their hunches and they get into a kind of groupthink because they're reinforcing each other's prejudices. And that seems to have happened here. 71% of economists were predicting a recession in 2016. In fact, of course, we seem to have grown faster in the second half of 2016 after the vote than we did in the first half, and we ended 2016 as the world's most successful major economy. The consensus among economists surveyed by Reuters was that unemployment would rise by around 9,000 a month following the vote. Of course, in reality, it fell. We were told that the stock exchange would collapse. We weren't told that that would be the Italian stock exchange and the British stocks would be the best performing in Europe. So not for the first time, the expert consensus was badly wrong. And in fairness, this is a repeated pattern. In the 1990s, the same people, the CBI, the TUC, the BBC, the economics faculties at universities, the hoary-headed grandees, they were telling us that it would be a disaster to keep the pound. In the 1980s, they were telling us that we had to join the ERM. In the 1970s, they were supporting prices and incomes policies. In the 1960s, they were supporting comprehensivization of schools. In the 1950s, they wanted national plans. In the 1940s, they wanted nationalization. In the 1930s, they wanted appeasement. I mean, you take it as far back as you want. When you see this corporatist consensus, we keep falling for it and thinking, well, they're experts, they must know what they're doing. But in reality, I just wish they really were as expert as they think they are.
Now, the subject of your latest book, What Next, is how we can get the best from Brexit. So what do we have to do now to get the best possible deal?
Well, I think that the real advantage of Brexit is the ability to be a freer, more deregulated, low-tax competitive economy. And that means that we should be interested and engaged with the affairs of every continent, including Europe. We should aim to have the freest possible trade with our 27 European allies. Their prosperity matters to us. A prosperous neighbour is a good customer. And of course, we should also aim to have freer trade with the other continents. And I think that that's possible. It's not a million miles away from what Switzerland does today. Access to the European single market, but the ability to sign its own free trade agreements with China and India and so on. If that works for Switzerland, which is heavily dependent on European trade, it will work a lot more for the UK, which is a larger home market and which sells a smaller proportion of its exports to the EU. So, I would like to use leaving the European Union not just to benefit us, not just to have lower prices and more productivity, but to try and use Brexit to revitalize the whole stalled world trading system. We haven't really had a proper free trade agreement, arguably, since NAFTA in the early to mid-90s. We need to move away from this kind of corporatist emphasis on common standards and common regulation and move back towards proper free trade based on mutual product recognition and mutual recognition of qualifications.
Now, the technical terms which surround Brexit often cause a lot of confusion, even for myself, and I've read a lot around the subject. I still get confused by some of them. Could you explain the difference, for example, between a free trade area and a customs union? Because I think that's the ones that keep cropping up.
It's a really, really critical point. So a free trade area is the normal way of encouraging unrestricted commerce between different states. A free trade area is a group of countries who have agreed to reduce tariff and non-tariff barriers among themselves in trade. A customs union is much more unusual. A customs union creates an internal free trade area, but it then creates a common external tariff, and it insists on running the trade policy of all of its members vis-à-vis third countries. So usually you only have a customs union where one country administers another, or where a tiny country effectively contracts out part of its policy to a larger neighbor. So, Swaziland is in a customs union with South Africa. The West Bank is in a customs union with Israel. Other than the European Union, there are really only two examples of customs unions in the world. One is Putin's, the Eurasian Union, which is very explicitly designed to be political, and the other is Mercosur in South America, which was effectively created by the European Union, which lobbied for its establishment and paid for it in its early stages. Everywhere else, the NAFTAs, the EFTAs, the ASEANs, they are free trade areas. And most economists will tell you that that's a far preferable way of going because it doesn't insist on exclusivity.
If the British press are to be believed, then Theresa May has got absolutely no plan for what happens next and the government's in a complete shambles around its negotiation strategy. Do you believe that's the case, or is there a plan for Brexit?
Well, if I were Prime Minister and I had a plan, I wouldn't share it with the press. It would be absolutely crazy to start signalling to my negotiating partners what I was going to do before the talks had even started. But in any case, that's not a fair summary of what she has said in public. if you're serious about getting the best possible deal, you need to prepare to walk away. You need to have a bottom line. And that can't just be a bluff. You really have to be prepared to do it. You have to be prepared to say to our European friends, look, if the deal is not good enough, we will just leave without any deal. But then having done that, you should work in good faith to try and have something much closer on the basis of it being mutually beneficial and bringing advantages to all participants. My personal view, and what I've set out in What Next, is that we should be, if you like, as Canada to the United States. In other words, we should have the closest military, commercial, diplomatic, and intelligence links compatible with being a fully sovereign country. Canada also has a federation on its doorstep. It couldn't work more closely with that federation, but obviously it's not a part of it. And I think it's not a bad model for us. But we're only likely to get that deal if the rest of the European Union accepts that we're leaving and understands that we're not coming as supplicants. If we come as supplicants, that's how we'll be treated. We'll be in the position that poor old Alexis Tsipras found himself in when he was begging for better terms without a plan B if he couldn't get them. Or, frankly speaking, I'm afraid to say, the same position that David Cameron was in during the renegotiation. Nobody believed in Brussels that Britain might vote no, might vote leave, and therefore no concessions were offered. So people have to understand that, yes, we want a deal, but no deal is preferable to a bad deal.
And where's the balance of power in that negotiation? Does one side have more in its toolkit than the other side in order to negotiate a good deal, or is it really a fair negotiation?
Well, you start from the proposition that countries don't trade with each other as a favour. Countries trade with each other for mutual advantage. It's not an act of kindness. Now, let's assume, for the sake of argument, and this is really an utterly unrealistic outcome, but just as an intellectual exercise, let's assume an absolute worst-case scenario where there was no deal whatever and where the two sides ended up applying WTO tariffs on each other's goods. To repeat, not a single credible politician on either side of the channel is arguing for this, but let's just analyze it. If that were to be the outcome, UK exports to the other 27 EU states would be subject to cumulative tariffs of just under £6 billion per year. Okay, so this is, even on the Remain side's figures, this is half of the sum that they told us was so trivial as our annual net contribution to the budget. UK tariffs on imports from the other EU 27 would be just under £13 billion. They'd be substantially larger. Now, to repeat, for the avoidance of doubt, we should not be levying tariffs on products from our European allies. We want to have free, open markets with countries which are our friends and whose prosperity matters to us. I'm simply illustrating how silly it is for the Nick Cleggs and the Tim Farrons and the Keir Starmers to go into this as though we held no cards at all and as though we were dependent on whatever we were given.
And thinking about the economic and the personal finance implications of Brexit, you offer a fairly upbeat assessment of direct democracy and free market capitalism post-Brexit. Will it be a smooth ride, do you think, over the short, medium and long term?
Look, I mean, no transition is ever completely smooth, or no important transition. If you're a programmer and you learn a different kind of coding, then while you're learning the new system, you're not earning from the old one. So there's always some transitional cost. You move from a pokey, dingy little flat to a handsome, fine new house. The move itself is still pretty stressful, right? That's if we didn't accept that, we'd never change anything. But I'm confident that 10 years from now, we will look back and wonder why we didn't do this a lot sooner. And I think that the benefits will be felt all the way through. There's a macro argument. Every continent on the planet is experiencing substantial economic growth except Europe. It is crazy for Britain to be entombed in the only customs union on the planet that is basically not growing. We have links of language and law, of custom and kinship to every continent and archipelago. It's crazy for us to make the Eurozone's problems our problems. But I think there are also real micro advantages that consumers and families will feel. Food should become cheaper, clothes should become cheaper, prices will fall because we will be paying world rather than European prices for basic commodities. And taxes should also fall, depending on how we use the dividend freed up by not having to hand over however many billion, whether you take the 10 billion net or the 17 billion gross figure. So there are big advantages. I mean, tax And food and clothes are a very big part of the budget of most households. And all of those, when we leave, should be falling.
And of course, equity markets and currency markets in particular really dislike uncertainty. How long do you think the uncertainty is going to last? Or do you think by, say, the middle of this year, we're going to have a very clear view of what happens next?
No, I think there's always going to be a measure of uncertainty. But there's uncertainty either way. I mean, there would have been great uncertainty also had we voted to stay. You know, who could tell us what our budget contribution would have been in 5 years, or what the migration situation on the continent would have been, or how many more bailouts we'd have been dragged into. You know, we mustn't make the mistake of confusing familiarity with certainty. I mean, to put this in investment or finance terms, I'm kind of with Nassim Taleb on this. You have a series of different branching futures, and that's always true whatever choice you make. By staying in the same place, you don't reduce the uncertainty. But, you know, that's really an argument. The fact that the markets like stability is kind of an argument against ever having any general elections, you know, and if you think about it, that would be a very silly argument indeed.
Absolutely. So we hear a lot about triggering Article 50 as the formal mechanism for leaving the European Union. Do you think we're still on track for that to happen by the end of March?
I don't see any reason why we shouldn't. And the Prime Minister has repeated this. The only way in which that won't happen is if there is a deliberate and calculated judicial coup d'etat by members of the bench who are politically opposed to Brexit. And I don't think we live in the kind of country where that can happen. But let's see. Let's hope I'm right.
Absolutely. Finally, then, I've seen you've written and you've got one concern about Brexit, how we might screw it up, and that's we might damage our relationship with Ireland. Can you tell us about that?
Yes, we might. I mean, if we get it wrong, there's no reason for us to get this wrong. I spent quite a lot of time campaigning in Northern Ireland during the referendum, and I noticed a return to tribal identification, which is not great news given that province's troubled history. I should explain to your listeners that I'm Ulster Catholic on one side and Scots Presbyterian on the other, so I sometimes am aware of dimensions that most English people perhaps are, with their long and peaceful history, blissfully unaware of. Yeah. But I noticed when I was there that there was a sort of self-segregation in debates, and that you could broadly guess from somebody's accent which side they were going to be on, and that's not great given the recent history of Northern Ireland. And if I were to put into one sentence what it is that's bothering nationalist and Republican voters, it would be, we now risk having a hard border because of how England voted. And so I think it's very important, whatever eventual solutions we find, that we keep open we retain the existing soft and open border within the island of Ireland. And that is perfectly feasible. You know, there's no reason either with goods or people to have a hard border there. As far as people goes, you know, as long as we share information between the Republic of Ireland and the UK on who has entered at a limited number of ports of entry, because we're both islands, there is absolutely no need to have any checks at the border, which, by the way, is impossible anyway. I mean, it's a very long and permeable border. Even at the height of the Troubles, it was never closed. Goods are a little bit trickier, potentially, because the European Union could insist on treating the Irish border as its external frontier and applying the full panoply of tests there. That, in a way, is an argument between Dublin and Brussels. But again, there's no need for it. And it would be, on one level, incredibly impractical to do it, because you'd be trying to impose customs checks on a border that nobody's ever been able to police in its entirety, when the alternative is to have those checks at the only 3 ports in the Republic of Ireland from which goods can travel to the rest of the EU. So practically, there's a really obvious solution there. It's just important that we approach this with sensitivity, that we work closely with our allies in Dublin. And like I say, I'm optimistic that will happen. I think relations between Westminster and Dublin have never been closer since partition than they are now.
Daniel, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today. Where can our listeners find out more about you? Can they connect with you on Twitter, for example? And where can they buy a copy of the book?
So I have a website, which is hannan.co.uk. I'm on Twitter as @DanielJHannan, And my book is called What Next? How to Get the Best from Brexit, and is available in bookshops or on Amazon or from the publisher Head of Zeus.
Fantastic. Thank you. We'll make sure we put show notes, links in the show notes too, so people can find that nice and easily. Thank you for your time.
Great pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you to Dan for appearing as a guest on Informed Choice Radio today. Whether you voted to leave or remain in the referendum last year, we are where we are today. Understanding the issues at stake as the UK negotiates not only her exit from the European Union, but our new trading relationships with the world is so important. Politics aside, if you want to gain a better understanding of the various issues, I highly recommend picking up a copy of Dan's book, What Next? How to Get the Best from Brexit. What was your favourite part of that conversation? Let me know on Twitter at Martin Bamford or in the comment section below the show notes for this episode at icradio.co.uk. That's also where you can find useful links and you can download a full PDF transcript of this episode. Don't forget to say thank you to Dan on Twitter at Daniel J. Hannan. Showing your appreciation to our guests with a quick thank you on Twitter is a really big help to us. It makes it much easier for us to secure more guests in the future. I also love your review of Informed Choice Radio on iTunes, on Stitcher, or anywhere else you get your podcasts. Visit icradio.co.uk/iTunes or icradio.co.uk/Stitcher. That will take you straight to our pages on those platforms where you can leave your rating and review. Ratings do help to push us higher up the iTunes charts. That helps us to reach more new listeners, and we really do appreciate it. Thank you for listening to this episode, and thank you for your continued support of this podcast. Until next time, I've been Martin Bamford, and this has been Informed Choice Radio. And remember, when it comes to your money, the more you know, the faster it can grow.